Tom Turner and Robert Holden, went along to Lower Marsh, to the library there, where TfL talked about their preliminary proposals for Westminster Bridge, and we were the first people there, so we had a good session with them.
The thought I had most prominently in my mind coming away from it was that they were treating it too much as traffic engineering and not nearly enough as urban design.
The good thing was that they're proposing one-way segregated cycle lanes. The bad thing is they don't connect with anything, either north or south. There's no connection to the north. There's an indirect connection along the embankment to
But just looking at the bridge itself, I think the big problem is that they have ignored the pedestrians. And actually, the pedestrians are at least half of the number of people using Westminster Bridge every day. And if you're going to do a proper plan for it, it has to include that number.
The whole point about Westminster Bridge is it's a symbol of London. It's a big tourist attraction. It's full of people at times, guarded by a Boudica, designed by Thomas Page, the engineer, but it relates to Charles Barry's work on the Palace of Westminster. And in fact, Barry did the Gothic detailing on Westminster Bridge, and that's why it's painted green, because that reflects the colours of the House of Commons. But it's a symbol of London. Look at any films of London has Big Ben with Westminster in the foreground, Westminster Bridge in the foreground.
Wordsworth put it rather well in 1802. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. And on the subject of majesty, there are few places in the world where you can see the sites of three palaces. Westminster Palace, of which there are some remains, Whitehall Palace, of which there are some remains, and Lambeth Palace, which survives in perfect condition.
Some remains, but I have you know that my wife worked in the Palace of Westminster for nearly the whole of her working life.
Yes.
It remains as a cultural icon and as a physical and administrative palace.
Of course. I simply meant that the actual residential palace component is long gone, although it remains technically to this day a royal palace, as you said. It's not just any bridge. It's a very, very special place, and therefore a great start on treating bridge design as urban design rather than traffic engineering.
Historically, it's recognised. It's grade 2 star listed.
It's really a very good thing that it's going to have, we hope, proper cycle lanes. And I think it's a great pointer for the future that although cycle traffic at present is only about 1 or 2% of the total people crossing the bridge, I think cyclists are going to have about 17% of the road space, if my figures are right. And I think that's a great way to set about cycle planning in London, that you provide for the number of cyclists you want to have rather than for the number of cyclists you've actually got.
However, TfL seem to be equivocal on proper provision. Proper provision by Dutch standards is a one-way, unidirectional, as proposed here, cycle lane of 3 metres wide. And what they proposed and what we saw in November were cycle lanes of 1.8 metre wide, but with the option of them widening to 2.3, still too narrow. If cycling is actually going to work, at the moment cycling levels are about 2.5%, are they? 2-3% in London. If you can get it up to 30 or 50%, as in Groningen, 30% as in most Dutch towns, and in Denmark, then you need to provide proper wide cycle lanes to Dutch standards.
But on the subject then, I think you've answered the question already, but I'll still ask it. Of the two proposals that TfL have, which are a 1.8 metre wide, fully segregated cycle lane, or a 2.3 metre wide lane separated only by a line on the road, which of those do you regard as the best?
Well, of the two, the wider one, but neither is sufficient. It should be 3 metres wide. You should just apply Dutch standards. The Crow bicycle design manual is in it, published by the Dutch in English. It's all available. And the point is that the officers that we talked to, they knew of it, they had not read it. TfL ought to buy it. It's only 100 quid or 70 quid, isn't it?
90 euros.
90 euros, 70 quid. It depends on the exchange rate. But this is raising the whole business about the total design of the bridge. And what about the pedestrians?
Well, I'll come to that. But before we do, let's just stick on the cycle lanes. And so if we agree that of the two alternatives that they offer, because it's a consultation, and so we should make a comment on those two alternatives, as well as mentioning the ideal situation which you have. What I would favour is the 2.3 metre lane, and then I would divide it from the motor vehicles with a rumble strip of the type you sometimes see in Holland, or else of some other permeable barrier. And I've got two reasons for that. The first is that the extra width for cyclists, as you've already said, is very important. But as important, at the busiest periods for pedestrian use, which I guess are weekend afternoons in summer, they tend to be fairly low usage for cyclists, although that may change when the superhighways come into operation. And so the pedestrians might spill. I mean, they will spill. They already spill into the cycle lane. And I think that if there's a barrier which forms a trip thing, then as well as detracting from the cycle space, it's also hazardous for pedestrians. And so of the two alternatives, I favour the 2.3. Do you agree about that?
I favour 2.3, and I'd favour even more 3, which is the minimum standard is applied in Holland, generally. But also, I wouldn't favour vertical barriers between footpaths and cycleways, or cycleways and roadways beyond a typical curb of 15 centimetres or perhaps a little bit higher, because it can be dangerous. In other words, cyclists can get crushed against barriers by HGVs.
Just taking further that point about the disparity between usage of the bridge between rush hours in a weekday and leisure use, really, at the weekend, don't you think there's a really strong case as a starting point for pedestrianising the bridge like the Mall on a weekend afternoon or 2 weekend afternoons?
Well, I would quote the example of Paris, where the North Bank motorway, as was originally pedestrianised weekends, or closed to traffic anyway, at weekends, and then is closed for the whole of August. Most recently it's been closed entirely. But in terms of London, I would have thought Westminster Bridge could easily be closed at the weekends, with traffic directed over Waterloo Bridge and Lambeth Bridge, and there should be consideration given to closing entirely in August.
I wrote a letter which was published in the Times some early 1980s in response to a point from Simon Jenkins, actually, arguing that the bridge should be completely and permanently pedestrianised. And I'm convinced that's its long-term future. I don't know how far in the future, but surely, because of the great landscape urban importance, which we've already discussed, surely it's going to end up as a pedestrian space. And the sooner we get there, the better from my point of view.
Not so sure about that. I would actually like the tramway back.
So one thing I do appreciate in that vein is seeing the bright red buses going over the bridge. I think they contribute, and the black taxis actually, they contribute a lot to the worldwide image of London.
Damn Boris Johnson for painting the Croydon tram link trams green rather than Transport for London or London transport red and cream as Ken Livingstone had. Damn Boris Johnson.
If you look at TfL's traffic figures for the bridge, the figure that strikes me in that list is that the largest number of vehicles is cars, and that's not really the best use of such scarce and scenically spectacular road space. So,
Tom, what's your pedestrian figure?
Thank you for mentioning to pedestrians. When TfL presented the traffic count for London Bridge, there was no mention of pedestrians. My own estimate is that it's probably somewhere between the figure for the Millennium Bridge by the Tate Modern, which we have, which is some 20,000
per day.
And yes, per day. And I think London Bridge is 32,000, and so one can just hazard a guess that it's probably about 20,000. But really, if TfL are going to do a responsible job of planning Westminster Bridge, they have to consider pedestrians.
Transport in London should be planned for people. The roads should not be simply seen as places for vehicle transit, but should also be seen as places for people walking and in wheelchairs.
Well, yes, and so that takes us back to our starting point, which is that Westminster Bridge is not a traffic engineering problem. It is an urban design problem, and it should be looked at in conjunction with the embankment, both east and west of the bridge, and also, very significantly, Belvedere Road, which is hardly used at all and a very cold, unfriendly space. And so there should be a proper urban design for the local area of the bridge.
And this touches on Boris's half-hearted cycle superhighway proposals. It just doesn't work. Similar to the south, at present there's no proposals for what happens as you get off the bridge and then pass through Waterloo or proceed east to Vauxhall. It just doesn't work. What's the point of being able to get from one side of the bridge, one side of the river, over the bridge to the other side of the river safely, and then gorging out into dangerous traffic?
All very true, but at least what they're doing now is of a decent quality, whereas the previous attempt at cycle planning for London, which was the London Cycle Network, we were supposed to get 1,000 miles of cycleway, and not a quarter of a mile of it was cycle infrastructure worth having. Whereas the superhighway network, as we began to build in 2015, is of a very respectable quality. It could be better, but it's very good.
We'll have a look in due course.
Thank you.